recording right now. So it'll be available to others, or if you missed something or you wish you could have gone back to a slide, you'll be able to see that later. Following this presentation, you'll be sent an email with a whole bunch of useful links and contact information to all the presenters this evening. So if you missed something, hopefully we can answer those questions later on with that email. I think that's all, Jenny, for the housekeeping items. As folks come in and out, if you have any questions, just send me a chat, and I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Annika. Appreciate that. So I just want to acknowledge that there are quite a few people who registered for this workshop, which I think is really awesome. You know, I know we've had some really smoky summers. We've seen some destructive wildfires on the west side of the state. We experienced a heat wave a month ago, and it's been really dry. We haven't had any rain for a while. So I think that that wildfire is really on people's mind right now, which I think is a good thing. I'll go into why a little bit later. And there's also been a lot of media coverage on wildfire lately too, more than I've ever seen, especially on the west side of the state. So it's great that people are paying attention, and I really appreciate that you're here to learn more this evening. And hopefully, I think the goal of tonight would be that you get some more understanding of wildfire risk and really feel empowered as a resident of Whatcom County to reduce that risk on your property. And also feel like there's the great resources out there too if you have other questions or need other resources. So that's kind of the goal of this evening. Just a really brief description of the agenda for this evening. So we're going to have 3 presentations back to back, and then after those 3 presentations, you will have an opportunity to ask questions. So throughout those 3 presentations, you can type your questions into the chat, since we're not going to unmute you during this part. So put all your questions in the chat. Annika will be monitoring those for us. And then when those 3 presentations are over, we will start going through some of those questions. And then following that, we're going to have a panel of our local fire chiefs and wildfire professionals where you can ask them questions either in the chat or you can unmute yourself. And you can ask questions about wildfire response, like, you know, what do I do if a wildfire occurs? How can I be notified? You know, questions along those lines. So we'll hear from those folks as well at the end of the evening. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. And our first speaker tonight is Kirk Troberg with Department of Natural Resources. He is the Cultion Unit Manager for our Northwest region. And Annika, if you haven't already given permission to Kirk to share his screen, go ahead and do that. And I will let Kirk take it away.
All right, thank you. As Jenny said, I am the Cultion Unit Manager for the Department of Natural Resources. And just to first kind of explain what that means, the entire state of Washington is split up into 6 regions. So Northwest region, which we are a part of, is Snohomish, Skagit, Whatcom Island, and San Juan counties. And those 5 counties are split up into 2 fire units. So there's the Salish Fire Unit, which is Snohomish Island and San Juan counties, and then the Cultion Fire Unit, which I manage, which is all of Whatcom and Skagit counties. And just as wildfire resources, we have 10 engines, 40 firefighters across the entire Northwest region. So half of that is in my unit, so 20 firefighters, 5 fire engines. At any given time, some of those are gone. Right now, 2 of my 5 engines are in Eastern Washington, and all 5 have already spent time in Eastern Washington this summer. In addition to that, we also have 2 helicopters at the moment in Mount Vernon, which are available anywhere in the state, but they're based here to serve here. One of those is a DNR owned and operated helicopter, and the other is under contract with the agency. So that's just a brief overview of who I am and what my role at DNR is. And so I'm going to start just by talking about WUI, or the Wildland Urban Interface. So you see that abbreviated as WUI, W-U-I, most of the time. And what that is basically is areas where humans and forests are beginning to coexist, which is becoming ever more prevalent. And I will share my screen here. So, okay, I believe that popped up. So my view looks a little different. Is my screen showing for you guys, Jenny and Annika?
Yes, it is. Yep.
Okay, excellent. All right, so this is, and I will drop a link for this in the chat once I'm done. But this is the Washington State Wildland Urban Interface map. So the agency went out and mapped all of the WUI areas across the state for the purpose of identifying them and their associated risks. So what we're looking at here is the red color is what they call intermix, and then the yellow color is interface. It's all important. They're equally important areas. It's really semantics more than anything. Intermix, they define by having two sides adjacent to wildland, and interface they define as being more than 50% covered in forested vegetated material. So that's what we're looking at here. The intermix is the red and the interface is the yellow. And since we're talking about Lake Whatcom, I will zoom in on the Lake Whatcom area here, just to give you an idea of what that looks like. So the gray area is the city of Bellingham. That's basically what we just consider urban, not a huge concern for wildland fire. The red areas, and I wish they had color coded this differently, because frankly, the red areas are intermixed. We should have made the red areas the interface. So think of them kind of backwards, because red seems more extreme to people usually. But these are all the areas around Lake Whatcom, these yellow and red areas that people are basically existing in the wildland. And as we see this urban sprawl spread out a little more and more, and communities are growing out away from urban centers and into the woods, and then you couple that with the idea that the vast majority of our wildfires, especially in Western Washington, well over 90%, are started by humans. And these are the areas that humans are, right? So that's kind of how we tie this to risk, is that these areas are at a higher risk than, say, the green area, because people aren't spending as much time there, people aren't living their lives there, people aren't cleaning up their yard and then burning their yard debris at that time and accidentally having that, spot and start a fire. So there's not a direct correlation to urban interface and fire risk. It's not like a one-for-one trade, but there is a correlation. I mean, places with urban interface are at a higher risk. And so until we get actual risk maps built, which is a project the agency is working on, but we're not there yet, this is probably one of the better tools to kind of look around at. So, like I said, I will drop a link for this in the chat, and the website itself will take you through and explain the entire map here before it lets you go to the dashboard that I just showed you. So you can see as you cycle through, and it kind of changes. There's the urban areas, and then the interface areas pop up, and then the intermix areas, and you can kind of see how it's all built, and then the wildland areas. So there's a really good, they call it a story map, basically, but a map to explain everything, how the map works, what the risks are, how everything is defined, and then once you're done with that, you can go to the actual map. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for the rest of it, but I do have a little more to talk about. The other thing I want to talk about quickly is forest health. So unfortunately, I'm not a forester, I'm just a firefighter. We did try to get someone from the DNR Forest Health Shop to come on tonight, but unfortunately, their staff is pretty much all wrapped up in fire suppression at the moment. But basically, what I can leave you with is that unhealthy forests equal a higher risk of wildfire, right? And what does an unhealthy forest look like? There's not a clear-cut black and white answer to that. An unhealthy forest in Western Washington looks different than an unhealthy forest in Eastern Washington, the same way that a healthy forest in the high altitudes of Western Colorado will look totally different than a healthy forest in the lowlands of Eastern Colorado getting into the Great Plains. Different areas, different ecosystems, different things that lead to healthy forests. So in Western Washington, lots of people see heavily overstocked stands of trees just really tightly packed, and they think that that means it's an unhealthy forest, when in reality, that's kind of the natural state for Western Washington forests. So the biggest indicators for unhealthy forest in Western Washington would be large areas, swaths of dead trees, where maybe there's disease or a fungal, root fungus disease, or a parasite, bark beetles come through and kill large portions. And then the other aspect of it is just snags, dead trees, right? That create a fire hazard over time. And one of the issues that we're seeing create these areas, I guess, of dead swaths of trees now is drought. As you're all, I'm sure, acutely aware, it's been 7 weeks or so now since we've had any type of meaningful precipitation, at least up in Whatcom County, and that's hard on the forest. You know, these forests weren't they didn't grow that way. These ecosystems weren't designed by nature that way. So that is definitely another stressor to the forests, and I'm sure that if you all look around outside, you can see that some of your plants are stressed, and that'll be more obvious in the fall. So drought absolutely brings an added challenge with it. Now, what I will say, I wish I could have spoken a little more eloquently about forest health there, but what I will say is you've all also probably heard, hopefully, about House Bill 1168 in the Washington State Legislature. That bill has granted the Department of Natural Resources $500 million over the next 8 years, starting July 1st of this year, to combat wildfires. And that's more than just hiring firefighters like me. Fortunately, that also involves forest health and building the forest health program. And so this time next year, our region, Northwest region, will have at its disposal for the public at least 4 new permanent forest health staff who are, going to coordinate forest health projects, coordinate fuel reduction projects, coordinate grant opportunities with communities to get the work done, and be out there to help people understand the risks and understand what they can do to help make them and just healthier in general. And in addition to that, we're going to have 10 permanent firefighters on a hand crew that will help us accomplish some of that labor. So more is coming. That would be the big takeaway, I think, from the DNR's end. And the risk is real in Western Washington, absolutely. I did an interview with the Western Front yesterday, which for anyone who doesn't know is Western Washington University's student newspaper. And the interviewer and I talked at length about how there's a mindset that wildfires are not a Western Washington problem. And they may not be a Western Washington problem on the scale that they are in Eastern Washington, but they are a Western Washington problem, and they do happen. Absolutely. My unit responded to 4 fires in Whatcom County in the last 3 days. So they're out there, they're happening, and I'm glad that you're all here to try and prepare yourselves. So thank you. That's all I've got.
Okay, thank you, Kirk. Appreciate your presentation there and sharing with us some upcoming resources that DNR will have in our region. That's great. So our next presenter, I'm just gonna move it a clip here because I want to make sure we can fit everything in, is Mike Perelskin with the City of Bellingham. He is going to be talking to us about the city's acquisition lands in the watershed. And I think he's already been made presenter, so I will just turn it over to you, Mike.
All right, thanks, Jenny. I'm gonna share my screen here. All right, can you guys see that?
You know, it's actually kind of truncated.
Yeah, let's see.
Maybe for some reason it's very small.
Same thing, huh?
Huh, yeah, interesting. Are you sharing the app or your whole screen? You might want to try sharing the whole screen.
Let's see.
Alternatively, you can just kind of, we can see that. Whoa, okay, there we go. Just start over.
One more shot here. Is that any better?
Yep, there we go.
Yeah, just in the way for some reason. Can I just move that off to the side?
Now you're set.
That's
good.
Work for you guys? Okay, cool. All right, great. Yeah, my name is Mike Perelskin. I am with the City of Bellingham, and I am a property specialist, which in this case means that I manage the Lake Whatcom Watershed acquisition land. And I'm just going to kind of zoom out a little bit and explain to you guys what that land is and why it's there. If I can change slides. Oh, there we go. There's one. Okay, so the Watershed Acquisition Program kind of started because, as you know, you all probably know, there's about 100,000 plus individuals that rely on Lake Whatcom as a drinking water source in Whatcom County. And a major issue with the lake is that there is phosphorus generated from residential and other land use practices, and it's conveyed to Lake Whatcom by streams, stormwater, and direct runoff. And over time, this excess phosphorus has caused a decline in water quality, and it basically just makes it really challenging to treat the drinking water. So out of that, the Lake Whatcom Management Program was created, which is a multi-tiered approach to address the water quality issues that we have in Lake Whatcom. And that plan has sort of 10 different areas where we're trying to deal with that excess phosphorus, and where I come in is land preservation. So the property we purchase is just to preserve and restore land that might otherwise be susceptible to development or other disturbance, and protect water quality as well as fish and wildlife habitat. So this map here shows the city's watershed acquisition land to date, and everything there in purple is current city watershed acquisition land. So essentially, we've become one of the major forest owners in the Lake Whatcom watershed, which is what brings me here today. And actually, if you received a postcard in the mail, it's likely that you live next to one of those purple parcels. That was intentional. So we have been partnering with the Conservation District to start outreach and addressing some of the threats that we see in the wildland urban interface that are either existent in properties that we've already purchased or in properties that we've purchased and then create a forested area for. Let's see. There we go. So to date, we've purchased almost 2,500 acres of land at a cost of about $35 million. And most of it is just land that's purchased with a fee simple title, and then we do have some areas where we've purchased conservation easements that either the city or the Whatcom Land Trust holds. And when we purchase these properties, I'm going to move on to a little more fun pictures here. We generally will go ahead and start cleanup. So this is a neat old car we cleaned out of the woods. So there's lots of hazardous waste removal or trash or really all sorts of stuff that we find out there. But yeah, we begin cleaning up properties as soon as we purchase them. This is another example. Well, if we purchase a property with a home or something that resembles a home, we'll remove it and go ahead and restore that area and try to provide a naturally functioning system on that property that we've acquired in order to enhance water quality. We also have a lot of different restoration areas where we're trying to mitigate the effects of noxious weeds. This is a major reed canary grass area in the Anderson Creek drainage, where we have a pretty significant restoration project. And I was actually there this week, and all these plants are about 10 feet tall now. And then we do monitor for wildlife and habitat. This is over in the just north of Agate Bay area. We've got some cougars, a little baby there, as well as a black bear in the Agate Bay Lane area. So if you live over in that area, you know you've got some neighbors. And we also manage our properties for forest health, and we have forest management plans that we create and follow so that we can mitigate increased wildfire risk as well as forest health. And then we do try and be good neighbors and provide fire breaks in areas where it's possible. So this is an example at the Agate Bay Preserve. This is kind of in the North Shore area where we created a fire break just to decrease that kind of activity in that wildland urban interface. So yeah, with that, I just wanted to make a quick introduction of why the city's here and our program, and introduce myself as a neighbor, because you probably, if you live next to one of these properties, you've probably seen me wandering around in the woods. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Appreciate your presentation. My presentation is next, so I'm going to go ahead and switch over here to my screen. Let's see. Okay, let's go to the next slide, if I can. There we go. Okay, so my presentation this evening is focused on how to reduce wildfire risk to your property And it's kind of the meat of what we're going to be talking about today. My presentation is a little bit longer, but I'll try and keep it interesting. But for starters, I want to just acknowledge that this workshop has been supported by the City of Bellingham, the Whatcom Conservation District, and a federal grant that we have called the AIM grant, which stands for Action, Implementation, and Mitigation. So before I get into the wildfire stuff, I thought it would be worthwhile just to really briefly describe what the Whatcom Conservation District is, since that's where this wildfire program is coming from. If you're not familiar with conservation districts, there's one in almost every county in Washington state. And essentially we promote stewardship of natural resources through technical assistance and financial assistance. And we have programs that, a wide range of programs really, that work with farmers on mud and manure management. We work on orca recovery and salmon habitat. We have a wildfire program. We have a stormwater program in the Lake Whatcom watershed. So we do a lot of different things focused on natural resources and really educating landowners and giving them the tools to have a better relationship with the environment and how they're using their natural resources. So that's the snapshot on the Whatcom Conservation District. There's a website here you can go to check out more information on that. Okay, so I want to give a little bit of a foundational information before I dive into the nitty-gritty of reducing wildfire risk on your property. So one of the things that we now know, somewhat recently, I would say, and there's been a lot of studies out of the University of Washington on this, is that wildfire risk is increasing in Western Washington. And as Kirk already mentioned, you know, we're used to seeing regular wildfires on the east side of the state, but on the west side, it's a little less, it's less frequent. And, you know, a lot of people think we live in this wet, moldy area on the other side of the state, right? So that's not really the case, because our conditions are changing, and the conditions that are changing are we're having increased air temperatures, less rain in the summer, and our snow is melting earlier. And all of that essentially leads to drier fuels. And when I say fuels, I mean vegetation and forests. So while we may not necessarily have more fires, because we still need an ignition source to have a fire, we're definitely, our conditions are more ripe for wildfire. So I kind of wanted to set that stage, that the science says, you know, our risk is increasing in Western Washington. And I think it's really important that, you know, in areas where we might not have thought about this before, we're really starting to think about it and pay attention, even in urban and suburban areas. So it's great that you're here learning about this. Okay, so there are basically three potential ignition sources when it comes to fire. There's surface fire, which is typically like a low intensity fire moving across the ground, burning through grass, leaf litter, things like that. And if there's no non-flammable interruption in that fire moving across the surface of the ground, then it can reach a home. So we also have crown fire, which is really kind of the extreme fire scenario, and we don't really see that on the west side. But that's an extreme case where the flames are basically moving across the tops of the trees, and the flame lengths are basically massive flame lengths that radiate enough heat to ignite a wood wall like 100 feet away. So this is really intense, massive destructive fires. And then we have blowing embers, which blowing embers are essentially like small to large, really, pieces of burning material, whether it's vegetation or whether it's, you know, parts of houses or something. But those embers are picked up by the wind, and the wind can blow embers up to a mile ahead of a fire. It can start spot fires other places, and these embers tend to land in small spaces. They get into the inside of houses, they land in gutters. And so embers are actually the #1 reason why homes burn down, even though you wouldn't think it, because small little burning things don't seem that dangerous, but really they are. So when we're looking at how to reduce your risk to your home, a lot of the focus is actually on embers. Okay, so there's also been a lot of research over the last 30+ years or so about why and how homes burn. You've probably seen, you know, in the news pictures of, you know, a massive wildfire that goes through a community in California, and there's 20 homes that are burned to the ground, and all that's left is the chimney. And then, you know, 3 doors down, there's 2 or 3 houses that are totally untouched, and it's like, okay, well, why did those homes survive and the other ones didn't? So over the last 30 years, there's been a lot of research done on that, and what was concluded was that homes are actually igniting due to the condition of the home itself and everything around it out to 100 feet. So they gave this area a term called the home ignition zone. And basically what we're doing is, when we talk about wildfire preparedness, we're really focused on this 100-foot home ignition zone, because it's where you can have the most bang for your buck, I guess I could say, when it comes to wildfire risk reduction. And you know, because we can have, like, fire is part of our natural ecosystem process, and so we can have a fire out there, but it doesn't really become a disaster until it's affecting humans and human property. And so when we're looking at reducing disasters, we're looking at what we can do within that 100-foot, sometimes 200 feet if your home is on a really steep slope. But that home ignition zone is where we really want to focus when it comes to reducing wildfire risk. So what we want to do within that zone is create what we call defensible space or survivable space. So the term defensible space is kind of implies that there will be somebody there to defend your home if you do construction and vegetation modifications to reduce your risk, but that's not always going to be the case. Because what happens a lot of times in large wildfires is there are hundreds of homes at risk at the same time, and there's not enough resources for firefighters to be at every home defending that home, whether it's safe for them to be there or not. And so what you really want to think about when you're working on this stuff is, what can I do to make my home survivable if I've been evacuated and there's not enough resources to be at my home to help defend it? So that's kind of the mindset we're thinking about, is that worst case scenario. Okay, so we're going to start talking about some details here. So looking at the construction of your home, we're going to start with the roof, because that's really the most vulnerable area of your home, just because of its exposure and its surface area, right? I think most people know that. If you have a Class A fire rated roofing material on your home, it's going to provide the best protection. So those are metal roofs, composition shingle roofs, tile. We don't always see those around here. I would say metal and composition or shingle are the most common. But the key thing about roofs is that maintenance is really important. You want to make sure your roof is in good condition, and you also want to make sure that anything flammable is cleaned off. So what tends to happen is a lot of tree debris will collect on your roof, because that's where it goes. And in your gutters, like in this picture you can see here, that stuff accumulates. It's really dry, and it's basically a fuel bed and for embers to land in. So if you can imagine embers landing in there, they're going to smolder, they're going to catch that stuff on fire. And then if you have vinyl gutters, it can melt your gutters, and it can potentially ignite the trim or the fascia board on your house, and the flames can get underneath your roof. So making sure that your roof is clean, especially where the roof line changes in those valleys and in those corners, and making sure your gutters are cleaned out during fire season is really a key thing to reducing your risk. Okay, so when it comes to siding and windows, in this picture on the left, it's on my left, hopefully it's on your left too, there's a research station where they get to do all these fun experiments, and this was a house that was built half with fire resistant materials and the other half not. And they blew a bunch of embers at it, and you can see what happened on the left side where there was wood siding and some other factors that played into it, it ignited, and then on the other side it didn't. And on the other side, the siding is actually the fiber cement siding, like Hardy Plank is a really common brand that you'll see. That doesn't carry fire. Brick, stucco, materials like that aren't going to carry fire in your siding, but wood will carry fire, and vinyl, as I mentioned before, can melt. So the other thing about siding, though, is it really a big factor as to whether your siding is going to ignite or not is actually what's right next to your siding, and we're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. But also windows. So a dual pane tempered glass window will withstand a lot more heat than a single pane window, which can crack, which basically leaves the inside of your house exposed to flame and embers. Okay. There we go. Vents. So this is probably, if I had to like reduce all of my suggestions to just one suggestion, I would say this is probably the most important one, and it's the most common one that I see when I do risk assessments at people's homes, are the vents. And so vents are areas where embers can actually blow inside and get into your house, whether it's your attic or your crawl space vents. What you want to have on your vents is 1/8 inch metal mesh screening. And typically what I see in most places is a 1/4 inch. I think that's probably a pretty standard size. But you want to have 1/8 inch metal screening on all of your vents because that's the size that will keep embers out that can do damage to the inside of your house. The other thing is, you know, in this picture on the right, those crawl space vents, when they're inset, they tend to collect a lot of debris like dead leaves and mulch and things like that. So if you can keep those cleared out, that will help as well. Okay. Decks and porches. Things that are attached to the house can also carry fire to the house. So when you have a raised deck or an elevated deck, one thing you want to, that's really important, is to not store anything flammable underneath that deck space. So you see the picture on the far left, this person, this is just it's not anybody we know, it's just a random picture off the internet. This person has stored a whole bunch of wood scraps and lumber underneath their deck. Many times I see people storing firewood under their deck, which is very common because it's keeping it dry. But that, you're just basically asking for trouble when you store flammable things underneath your deck, because if embers get lodged in there and that stuff catches on fire, it's going to carry to the deck above it, and that's going to carry to your house. So never store anything flammable under your deck. You also don't want to have a bunch of vegetation growing under there. The other thing is on top of your deck is really important too. So where your deck meets your siding, there's usually a little bit of a gap there. And it's the same place where tree debris tends to collect. You can see as an example in this middle picture, you know, pine needles, pine cones, leaves, twigs, all that kind of stuff tends to collect in all those cracks and crevices on your deck and in the corners. And that's the same place embers will land. So, which is basically, again, another fuel bed for embers to burn and catch your siding or your deck on fire. So you also want to make sure that the surface of the deck is cleaned off during fire season as well. And then in the picture on the right, it's just an example of what somebody has done. They've taken, they've put gravel, their deck isn't very high off the ground, but they've taken gravel and put that underneath there to help kind of protect that deck and make it a little bit less of a flammable situation. Okay, so moving from the structure out to the space around it, I want to make sure I'm doing okay on time here. That first 5 feet perimeter around your house is really probably the most vulnerable, because if you have anything flammable right up next to your house and there's fire, it can carry to your structure or your house. And so ideally that first 5 feet around your home is a non-flammable zone. So whether that's concrete walkway or gravel or bare dirt, that area should really be a non-flammable zone, and then you can have your plants and your mulch and stuff outside of that. You can see that in this picture on the right, this person obviously lives in a very wooded area. I know there's a lot of folks from Sudden Valley on here, which is a beautiful wooded area. But in areas like that, you get a lot of that tree debris that drops on the ground or on your roof. And so in this picture here, this person just really needs to rake back those leaves and that tree debris at least 5 feet away from the house, and that will help create that non-flammable zone, which is a lot of work. It's a lot of maintenance, I realize that. Oops, skipped one. Okay, so yay, mulch. So I know that in the Lake Whatcom watershed, there are programs that promote getting rid of lawn and adding mulch and planting native plants, which is great because it helps filter that excess phosphorus in our runoff. So mulch is great for so many things. All the reasons listed here: discourages weeds, helps maintain soil moisture, can look nice. But one thing to know about mulch, I'm trying to get my slide to advance here. There we go. Is that any organic mulch, you don't want to put that within 5 feet of a structure because mulch is flammable and it can carry fire to your house. So you can still use mulch, but you want to avoid the shredded mulch material, particularly Western red cedar, because that tends to be more flammable. You want to use a low phosphorus mulch in the watershed. And then if you have the option of using rock mulch within that first 5 feet, that's a great sort of non-flammable option. You can even put some, small perennial type plants in there if you want to, but you definitely want to keep that organic mulch at least 5 feet away from your house. And this picture right here is just a picture of a home that was damaged from a mulch fire because the mulch was right up next to their house and it caught on fire. So I'm sure if you want examples of that, some of our fire chiefs can tell you some stories. Come on. Sorry, I'm having a hard time advancing my slide here. There we go. Can you guys, okay, sorry. There's a little bit of a delay between my screen and the screen I'm seeing on here. So, okay, let's talk about propane tanks for a minute. Propane tanks are things that people like to hide because they're not very pretty. And this is just some examples of how you could get creative with your propane tanks. Because what happens is propane tanks that are working properly are meant to off gas. So if there's intense heat and pressure is building up inside that tank, they will start off gassing and releasing some of that pressure so that they don't explode, because we know that that's an extremely dangerous situation. So you want to make sure your propane tanks are working properly. They're in good working order and the venting feature works. But you also want to make sure that you don't have any flammable vegetation within 10 feet around that tank, because if it's off gassing and there's flames nearby, that creates an even more a dangerous situation. So this slide is just kind of meant to be a little bit funny and give you some creative ideas of what you can do with your tank if you have to unveil it from all the vegetation that is hiding it. Okay. So let's talk about fire resistant landscaping. And I will do a time check really quick. Okay. So there is kind of this misconception that in order to have a fire resistant landscape, it has to look like the surface of the moon. It has to be paved over and all concrete. And that's just not the case. You can have a beautiful landscape with trees and vegetation that looks like the picture on the right, maybe, without having this moonscape of a yard. And most people who live in the Pacific Northwest recognize or appreciate the trees and the greenery that we live among, and they're not about to pave over everything. So let's just get that out there. Come on, there we go. So there are some basic concepts to keep in mind when it comes to fire resistant landscaping. And this is kind of applies to changes that you make in your landscape that already exists, or if you are building a house and you are making new landscape decisions, this can help inform some of those decisions as well. But basically, one of the things that's really important is to create breaks in the fuel in your landscape. And when I say fuel, I'm talking about plants and trees and things like that. Because if you have a fire moving across the surface of the ground, there needs to be a break in that so that it doesn't reach your house. And when I say break, we're talking about like planting in clusters. So you can have a planted area of a group of plants with maybe some landscape bricks around it, or you can have, some sort of a rock feature, rock wall, or a water feature, or anything that really kind of breaks up that flammable fuel, so that if a fire is moving across the surface of the ground, it will either lay down or it will go out. Another way to do that is to have some small patches of lawn, if you're into that. But it's really important to keep that grass short. So 4 inches max is how you want it, the maximum height of that lawn area. So breaking up your fuels is a really important concept to think about when it comes to landscaping. Oh, here's my disclaimer. So I know I'm talking to a group of people who most of you live in the Lake Whatcom watershed, and there are specific codes and restrictions that you are required to follow. So my disclaimer is essentially to make sure that you always double check with those codes and restrictions prior to making landscape changes. And that, you know, we recognize that there are a lot of things to consider when you're doing things like this, and in no way are we trying to be counter to any local ordinances or neighborhood ordinances or anything. So make sure that you're still following the rules when you're incorporating these concepts. Okay, so the other really important concept to think about is creating not just breaks across the landscape, but creating some space vertically in your vegetation and your fuels. So what happens is if you have continuous fuel or plants from the ground up into larger trees with low-hanging branches, you're essentially creating a fire ladder, and it allows fire to climb from the ground up into the trees, and that becomes a much more difficult fire to fight. So you want to keep fire on the ground if possible, and typically what that entails is pruning. Most of the time when I'm out doing a risk assessment, my recommendation involves pruning up some lower limbs of conifer trees. So for example, a very common scenario in Western Washington with fire ladders is tall dry grass next to a big blackberry patch right underneath Western red cedar branches that overhang it. So in that scenario, sometimes you want to remove the blackberries and that's enough space, and you want to mow the grass. Sometimes you need to prune up your trees. So we're talking like 6 to 15 feet of pruning up off the ground, or 3 times the height of the vegetation that's below it. And there are definitely some tips and tricks for how to properly prune a tree so you don't damage it. And we have some of that information on our website if you're interested. But creating some of that vertical space between your vegetation can really make a difference as to how intense the fire gets and how quickly it can spread. There we go. Sorry, there's this major delay. Okay, so the other thing to consider is using native plants in your landscape. Native plants thrive in our conditions for the most part, and a thriving plant is going to be a less flammable plant. So, what are fire-resistant plants? So fire-resistant plants tend to have higher moisture content in their leaves. They have less buildup of that dead vegetation in the center and underneath them. They tend to be more drought resistant, and they usually have a lower compact growth form. So this scale on the right side of the slide here kind of shows you a range of more fire resistant plants to less fire resistant plants, succulents being more fire resistant down to conifers that are less fire resistant. So flammable plants, you know, even a plant that's considered fire resistant can actually be flammable if it's unhealthy and it's water stressed. So keep in mind it's a little bit relative. But in general, flammable plants tend to be water stressed. They accumulate a lot of dry and dead material within them, and they also tend to have a high oil or resin content. And these are some pictures of some really common plants, Scotch broom being an invasive one, that we see around here in people's yards that are particularly flammable, especially the arborvitae. I have those in my yard, but they have they're dense and they have a lot of dead stuff in the center and underneath, and they're shaped like a triangle, so they go up like Roman candles. So this is just some things to keep in mind as far as, well, I have a bunch of juniper in my yard, maybe I should think about replacing that with something more fire resistant. Okay, so moving out kind of beyond where your landscaped yard is, but still within that home ignition zone of 100 feet, which I recognize in a lot of cases might be on your neighbor's yard. So you do what you can on your property. But disposing of any accumulation of dead plant material or even live branches on the ground, those stacked up with intertwined with all that airspace in it is basically the perfect fire building situation. So you want to remove accumulations of dead stuff off your property, or at least out of that zone. You want to manage or reduce invasive species, like I know Mike from the city was talking about dealing with some invasive species on some of their city acquisition lands. A Scotch broom is a particularly flammable one. And then, you know, in the more forested area, sometimes thinning unhealthy understory trees can be a good thing if it's in that home ignition zone, especially if it's a hazard tree that could fall on a house or a trail or a recreational area that people are using. And so, you know, having dead trees isn't necessarily a bad thing because it can be great for wildlife, but within that home ignition zone, it's not really ideal for wildfire. So some other considerations for those of you that have some more acreage, some more larger properties, you know, a canopy cover is actually a really great thing because it does provide shade and it reduces soil temperatures and helps the soil retain more moisture, so that vegetation is a little bit less flammable. So that's actually a good thing. And then thinking about, like, okay, if there was a fire nearby, do we have access for firefighters to lay hose or to get to that fire to help build a fire line or defend it? And you know, incorporating trails into your forest is a great thing too. It also creates a little bit of a fuel break. Okay, time check. All right, I'm a little bit over, but I'm almost done. So, okay, I kind of went into the details of how to reduce risk on your property, and now I want to just really quickly talk about this Firewise program, which you may or may not have heard of. It's essentially it's a national program. There's, I think, 1,500 plus communities across the country that are a part of this program. And what it is, it's a, like I said, it's a recognition program, but it provides a framework for neighbors and communities to work together on reducing their wildfire risk. So the process for being part of this program includes having, you know, a risk assessment done by a wildfire professional like me or some of the other speakers you'll see on here tonight, and then helping the community kind of identify some actions to take to reduce that risk. And each community is required to invest a certain amount per dwelling each year on reducing wildfire risk. And one of the things that the Conservation District can help with is guiding communities through this program and sometimes helping them find funding to do various projects like chipping projects and things like that. So this is just a list of some of the Firewise communities we have in Whatcom County. Our most recent one was Clark's Point, and they joined in 2019. There we go. Okay, so just really quickly, for the Whatcom Conservation District and our wildfire program, we do have some really great resources for people. One of them that I think is really valuable is the free wildfire risk assessments. Those are basically entail scheduling a time with me to come, or two of our other staff that do this, to come out, meet with you on your property. We walk around your property. We offer observations and suggestions on how to reduce the risk, wildfire risk specific to your property. We usually bring resource handouts for you to keep, and then there's a follow-up report that we do that only goes to you, and it's essentially for education purposes, and you get to decide whether you take our advice or not. But it's a really great service that I feel like a lot of people benefit from. And I know that when you guys registered for this workshop, there was an option to check a box that said, I'm interested in having a risk assessment on my property. So for those of you that did that, we will be following up directly with you to schedule those. For those of you that are on here that didn't do that and want to, it's not too late. There's a link on our website. I think Annika's just put it in the chat that you can click on, and you can just sign up for one of those through our website, and we'll get back to you and schedule that. So The other thing we offer, as I mentioned before, was guidance through the Firewise USA program if your community is interested in doing that. And then we do presentations and outreach events on wildfire education. We're doing that right now. And then, of course, you know, if there's a community that doesn't really want to go through the Firewise program framework, we can also help communities do some sort of neighborhood scale wildfire planning that doesn't require being part of that Firewise program. So for more information on that, this is our website directly to our wildfire pages. And that's it from me. This is my contact information. And I think that was all I needed to share, and we're going to move on to some questions. So if you have any questions that you haven't yet put into the chat, go ahead and do that now. And Annika is going to read through those and direct them to the most appropriate person. And I am going to stop sharing my screen.
Okay, we've had some good questions coming in. If all of the folks who have spoken already and our panel could turn on your video, then we can try to get all the questions answered as best as we can, because I might not know where to shift these questions. Some of the questions that came in to organizers themselves is, and I think we answered that a little bit, but who manages the Whatcom land acquired by the Lake Whatcom Acquisition Program, and then who to contact basically to establish a fire break. And I believe that's Mike Perelskin. If you want to just quickly, City of Bellingham is who is managing that land, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. Yeah, so I do manage those watershed acquisition properties, and then further up in the chat, I put my contact info. So regarding stuff like fire breaks or property boundaries, yeah, you just would contact me. But you know, I would also be looking to those assessments by Jenny before we kind of try to identify and pool resources in the higher risk areas. So yeah, just feel free to reach out and we can work with the CD to do that kind of thing.
Excellent. We had a question early on. This is from Kyle Cassidy. Is overgrown understory vegetation an indicator of poor forest health? Thinking in terms of fuel buildup from decades of fire suppression. I don't know, is Kirk the right person to answer that question? Or Jenny, you can kind of make the call.
I'll take a swing at it. In the short answer, sometimes fuel buildup in and of itself is not necessarily a hazard or it's an indicator of an unhealthy forest. Like I said, our typical Western Washington stands are overstocked and can be thick. Jenny talked some about ladder fuels and about the vertical continuity of fuel, and that is what, from a wildfire perspective, you want to interrupt, is that vertical continuity of fuel that would allow a fire to get from the ground up into the canopies. I hope that answers the question, but the goal isn't to, with forest health and stuff, isn't to eliminate fire from the landscape altogether. I think Jenny mentioned that as well. It's just to keep it low intensity and manageable and on the ground, so that when it does happen, when it does come through, we can deal with it, and it's not a big issue. So that's the idea. It's not to eliminate fire from the landscape. It's just keep it low intensity. And so eliminating that vertical continuity of fuel will definitely help in that regard. But as far as, is it just an automatic sign of, hey, there's a lot of brush here, this must be unhealthy? No, it's not quite that cut.
Thanks, Kirk. And then we have some questions around what about a buried propane tank? I think that's a really great question, and it might be, I don't know, Jenny, do you have ideas on that?
So that's actually a really good question. I mean, I imagine a propane tank underground isn't going to be an issue with embers or fire moving across the surface of the ground. But I don't know if there are other dangers associated with buried propane tanks. That might be something. I'm thinking let's punch that question to our fire chiefs when we do the panel then and see if they have anything they want to add to that.
Excellent, because I see some others in here that I think would be better answered through that panel. But I do like the idea. This Jack Thompson asked, what is the best way to get rid of slash piles? Is it chipping and mulching? Okay versus burning? Jenny?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I would say the most common and effective way to get rid of those piles is to chip them up. And if you can, it's okay to spread those chips back out into the landscape as long as they get spread out and not put in a giant pile. So chipping is a really great way to do that. There's been in our Firewise communities, both in Whatcom and Skagit County, chipping projects have been a really popular and relatively inexpensive way for communities and homeowners to actually get their properties cleaned up, get roadways cleaned up, and get that stuff chipped up and just broken down back into the soil or hauled off for use by a garden club or a church or something. So that's a really common way to do it. I know I don't want to be the one that says burning is okay. I think that's dependent on the conditions and the size of the pile and whether you need a permit and things like that. So that could be another question to put to our firefighter panel here in a little bit as well.
Great. And then, you know, this is great from Elena and TJ. What if you have a vacated street property? So not next to acquisition lands, I'm assuming, but just a vacated property that's designated wetland, but with dry, long grass, blackberries, dead trees. Can we reduce that hazard with some maintenance, or or what to do about that situation? I think it's going to be quite dependent, but Jenny, do you have any ideas there?
Yeah, I'm just reading through the question to make sure I understand it. So if you have a vacated street property designated as a wet, okay, so this is a tricky one. If it's a wetland, it's probably a critical area. And so if it's a designated critical area, then you would need permission from the county or the city to do maintenance. And I know that sometimes there are some provisions for being allowed to take out dead trees depending on how it's done. But that would be, that's something that I would talk to, I don't know if you're in the county or the city, but I would talk to the planning or permitting folks about that and the process for being able to do something like that. That's a really great question.
And you'll see I just put in the chat, someone had asked specifically about Lake Whatcom watershed landscaping as related to fire. So I put in the resources that we have for putting in native landscaping and some wildfire safe tips. But I'm going to ask actually one of the co-presenters here to put in, there is a landscaping guide to Lake Whatcom that I'll find here, and I'll put that in there. Great. Okay, so thank you, Jenny. So if here's one from Valerie. So if I want to put a gravel border around my property, do you have any tips to reduce weeds, or is that an ember hazard? I'm assuming, are the weeds an ember hazard?
Annika, I meant to say, do I use Typar under the gravel, but autocorrect wouldn't let me do it. So I didn't know if the Typar would be a fire hazard for those embers getting in there.
Got it. Okay. Darn autocorrect. Thank you for the clarification, Valerie.
So somebody needs to tell me what that product is that Valerie's referring to. Is that like a weed mat?
Yes.
Okay, like is it rubber or like what
it's
is
a
the
black fabric?
Okay. That's a very good question that unfortunately I do not know the answer to. But I would be happy to look into that and follow up with you, or if you wanted to send me an email directly, I could respond to that with some more information. That's a really great question because I know weeds do pop up through gravel, but I imagine, I'm just trying to think through this a little bit. You know, it probably is dependent on how thick you put the gravel down on top of that. That would probably be part of it, but I will have to look into that product and see a little bit more about it because I don't know off the top of my head.
Jenny,
Yeah.
Can I bail you out a little on this one?
Yeah, bail me out, Bill.
I would absolutely, first off, if you can find a weed barrier that actually is a barrier to weeds in your gravel, please send me the link to that. Because you will find most of them help to suppress the weeds that were already there, but will not necessarily stop weeds from growing later. But as far as the materials go, you know, if they're underneath that rock, the embers can't get to them. So the, you know, laying a barrier down under the rock is not going to promulgate fire from ember issues because your rock is going to create that barrier for you. I think that it's, you know, can it burn? Absolutely. If the fire gets down, you know, I would want to make sure you're covering that barrier completely. A lot of times you'll see the barrier maybe come up on the edges or around it. I would want to try and keep it all covered by that. But, you know, is it gonna promulgate fire that's gonna be an ignition issue for your home? No.
Okay. Thanks, Bill. Yeah, I would imagine as long as it's covered and your gravel is, you know, thick enough so there's not gaps and spaces, then the embers aren't going to be able to get through that gravel.
Okay, so I think that some of the other questions that I've received are more focused on the panel. Unless folks want to, you can just put anything in the chat and I can call on you and you can just say, as opposed to autocorrect ruining your text. So feel free to just put anything in the chat like hello or I have a question or hand raise because we don't have that. But otherwise we can move on to the panel.
It looks like, okay. I'm seeing some questions come in about road and evacuation related to Sudden Valley, and I think those are the ones we're gonna, yeah. So I think, why don't we go ahead and move on to our panel, and then if other questions come up that are more directed at myself or Mike or Kirk, we can answer those too. But so this next part is, I wanted to have, well, first of all, I wanted to give you an opportunity to meet your local fire chiefs, and you know, Kirk, who may or may not be responding to a fire in your neighborhood, and give you an opportunity to ask them about wildfire response and like, okay, if we have a wildfire, what are some of the things we can expect? and I don't want to feed you all the questions I think you should be asking, but I'm sure there are some out there. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have all of our firefighter panel, which includes, I'm going to run through this really quick. Bill Hewitt, David Dara, Mitch Knowles, Sean Ward, and Kirk Troberg. Did I miss anybody? I think that's everyone. And I'm going to have them take a turn and introduce themselves. And if they have any thoughts they'd like to share, they can go ahead and do that. And then we will open it up to any questions you might have. You're welcome to put them in the chat. I know some are already in there that we'll direct to them. Or if you'd like, I think you can just, Annika, do you want them to just type a question mark in if they want you to unmute them so they can ask a question? Okay.
Yes, I love that. That's a great idea.
Okay, if you want to ask a question verbally, just type a question mark in the chat and Annika will unmute you and call on you and you can just ask the question verbally. Okay, so I'm going to turn my screen off here and so that you will only be seeing the panel. And then I think, Bill, why don't you go ahead and start by introducing yourself and then you could pass it on to the next person until everybody's had a chance to introduce themselves, even though I know we've already met Kirk. All right.
Well, thank you, and thanks for allowing me to jump in earlier too. But my name is Bill Hewitt. I'm the fire chief for City of Bellingham and Whatcom County Fire District 8. So we cover everything inside the city limits and then out into the Alderwood neighborhood, around the airport, and the majority of the Lummi Nation out on the Gooseberry Peninsula. So we have probably not the largest geographic area, that's Sean's End, but we have probably the largest population center here in Whatcom County within our area. And with that, I'll pass it over to Sean.
Geez, thanks, appreciate that. Sean Ward with North Whatcom Fire Rescue. I'm Division Chief of Operations. My chief was unable to participate tonight due to a family conflict. We cover District 4 area, which is Britton Loop, Van Wyck, North Shore area, as well as areas from Blaine all the way to Everson, the Canadian border, down to right around Smith Road. So rather large geographical area. You name it, we have it. Not as much populace as Bellingham does, but we do have our Birch Bay and Blaine area that gives us a pretty good group of folks up there. And I'll pass it along to Chief Knowles.
All right, thank you. My name is Mitch Knowles. I'm the Assistant Chief here at South Whatcom Fire Authority. We don't cover quite as large of an area as either of them, but we do have our own topographical challenges with a couple of mountains in between that make travel hard for us. We cover the areas of Sudden Valley, Geneva, right up to the city limits in the Geneva area. And then also we get back traveling through the U Street Road area and over to Lake Samish and all of that area down to the Skagit County border. And then also all the way over to Chuckanut between the city limits and Skagit County. So we have a fairly large area and diverse types of coverage areas. So I'll pass it to Chief Dara as we move around the lake.
Oh, you're still muted, David.
Somebody should have control of me, I swear. Hi, I'm David Dara, Fire Chief down here at Whatcom County Fire District 18. I'm probably the smallest little spot out of everybody that's here. We're approximately 6 square miles, cover all of South Lake Whatcom to the Skagit border, and then over Park Road towards Highway 9. And we just have a couple of small community and campgrounds out here. And that's about it.
I already introduced myself, so hello.
Great. Okay. So we've met everybody here on the panel, and I think, Annika, would you like to find those initial questions that first came in and read those to this group here so we can see, so we can get some answers to those. And then you guys, if you have, please go ahead and type any questions you have in the chat as we go.
Great. Yeah. So something that came in earlier, and I think Mitch will probably answer this, is from Whitney Pierce. I live in Sudden Valley, and our neighborhood only has one road in and one road out. How do we plan for a fast-moving wildfire?
Yeah, and I'll start that. Obviously, there's a lot of areas where that applies, and Sudden Valley has certainly a dense population and I think the epitome of the wildland urban interface. I think Kirk would probably agree with me there. The challenges that we have with access are definitely not, don't go unnoticed. What I can say to that is, we do have different types of fire behavior than you see in Eastern Washington as far as fire growth and some of the large explosive fires. That doesn't mean we don't have the potential to have fast moving fires here. What I can say is that having that plan early of if you had an event that you were made aware of, either firsthand seeing it or being notified through in-person evacuations through our fire department, neighboring fire department, or the county sheriff's office or other entity, that you have a plan to leave immediately. And obviously there are evacuation levels that come into play there. We partner with the Sheriff's Office Division of Emergency Management in coordinating the evacuation planning. But dead-end roads certainly are a challenge. And what we would say in that scenario is we have a balance between us being able to get into that area as well as getting the community members out of that area. And early notification is certainly key. And that's one of the reasons behind why we're here, is to address the prevention methods that we can have in place to slow the spread of those fires and to give people time to move away from the area. Exploring footpath travel if it really came down to where the road wasn't the path to take, having an alternate method. Through a neighbor property, a lot of Sudden Valley has properties that butt up to each other, but I know a lot of them also are on steep hills and thick forests, which we don't want you in the middle of the night or something like that if there was a fire. But I don't have a perfect solution for that scenario, but we are aware of it, and it's definitely a priority that when we respond to a wildfire, that getting a full set of eyes around the entire incident and seeing where that fire is going next, and planning the things, anticipating where that fire goes and how it's going to react, and making sure the structures are protected is a high priority. We know we're in a heavily populated area, so that is the highest priority, obviously, is life safety and property conservation. Hope that kind of answers or at least addresses your question. Again, I wish I had the ability to provide perfect wide access anywhere that I could, but unfortunately that's a reality we deal with, and we try to do the best we can with prevention and then mitigation and what we call pre-incident planning, having a plan before it happens.
Great, thank you for that. And I think in following up to that question, Jacob asked, will there be a follow-up session that focuses on worst case scenarios, emergency evacuations, other concerns? And that is not the purview necessarily of the Whatcom Conservation District, but I feel like there is a place or where you can sign up for alerts, and that I don't know if Mitch or Sean, or I don't know if you guys know where to do that, where folks can sign up for through emergency management. I feel like that would be good next step.
I will say the notification process, the website is not completely up to date, but the alert sign up does work if you visit whatcomready.org. There is a public alert sign up feature there. Division of Emergency Management and Office of Emergency Management for the city. Chief Hewitt can probably speak to that a little bit on, but there are systems in place where we can utilize reverse 911 options and notifications if people sign up. A lot of the previous reverse 911 options don't really work very well anymore because no one has landlines, which is what those automatically trigger. So a lot of them are based on people opting in to alerts in the area. And I'll tell you that, you know, the worst case is getting door-to-door notifications, but there are methods that we can use. And if you are able to monitor social media sites and things of that nature, there are several that monitor news at a pretty fast rate in the county. And I certainly would suggest those. I know that's not a best option, but the emergency alert sign up is available on whatcomready.org.
Great, and I did put that link in the chat for folks. Thanks to Catalina who sent it to me. We're all helping each other out here. So there's some questions, again, around preparedness, which I'm going to ask Jenny to answer here in a question or in a second. But lots of people have fire pits. What can be done to keep them safe and prevent them from sending embers aloft? Do any of you gentlemen have ideas about fire pits?
Well, I'll say this from the DNR perspective. There are approved fire pits that you can purchase that are metal rings. I know a lot of people just use the cement blocks and that kind of stuff. The best thing from a fire pit perspective you can do is isolate the actual fire pit, so there's no continuity of fuel getting inside your pit, right? So it's not just stacking some cement blocks on your grass and calling that good. Actually having a real fire pit and isolating that with gravel or cement or whatever it is. And then beyond that is, you know, there's a limit to the size of fires that people can have. It changes based on times of year and whose jurisdiction you're in and some other stuff, and that can be kind of confusing for folks to track. But those, as long as people are burning within those thresholds, so say within a 3x3 campfire threshold, and keeping this fire small, that should limit, you know, it's certainly not impossible that an ember could escape and get somewhere, but keeping your fire small should limit that kind of issue, I guess.
Yeah, I'll add in there, you know, both Chief Knowles and I spent a little bit of our time in our careers doing investigations and open burning enforcement. And I will say probably the biggest thing, you know, we do have very prescriptive requirements in both the city and the county for what a recreational fire enclosure looks like. One of the biggest problems I've seen over the years is that we take that 3-foot enclosure with the 16 high inch walls and then we fill it 6 feet high full of fuel. And that's not the intention. And so, you know, when we talk about what's, you know, kind of some of the safest things you can do when you're doing that is the intention is to keep the fire smaller than the side walls of the enclosure. And then the other thing is to look at what are you burning. Certain types of wood are going to give off more embers and sparks and that. We very much recreational fires were intended to only be charcoal and seasoned firewood. It was not meant to be a way to bypass the open burning regulations and burn up whatever junk lumber you had on your property or tree limbs you just cut down the hour before you started burning them. So that's probably some of the biggest safety recommendations that we can make. The other big one too is, and again, it's a requirement that's there right in the fire code, is that you do have water available to extinguish the fire immediately. So that doesn't mean that, you know, there's a hose on the front of the house and my fire pit's in the back of the house. It means that you actually have the hose there next to the pit while you're burning, or you have 5-gallon bucket of water that you can quickly dump onto the fire and douse it.
I think, well, first, thanks, Bill. You outed me. I was trying to hide my fire marshal experience. I'm still trying to get over it. But I'd say too that I think DNR has some data on this over time, but campfires that meet all of the regulations and requirements out there have a very low chance when they're actually following the rules of starting unintended fires. And that's the key, right? Is oftentimes we're using branches or unseasoned wood. Those types of materials don't burn well. When we're using the seasoned stuff or the charcoal, they burn really well and efficiently, which means they put off less smoke, less ember, less unburned material that gets carried in the air. So it's really important to follow those. I put the link to the County Fire Marshal's Office outdoor burning site that has all the requirements for recreational campfires, and there's also a guide on there. Many moons ago, I created it for the outdoor fireplace requirements as well, because those are quite popular as opposed to the in-ground pits. And one of the big things that we always recommend and do is use some kind of a spark arrestor, which basically is a screen with really small holes in it. So that's another way that you can keep embers from flying. So.
Oh, these are great tips. Thank you so much. Now, I do want to be mindful of time. It is 8 o'clock. So if folks want to get off now, got a couple more questions, but we won't be offended if I see that your name disappears. But I just, yeah, sure.
I want to jump in really quickly because I want to share some information really quick before people start to jump off, and then you can go ahead or you can stay on while we answer some more questions if you would like to, and if our speakers are open to that. So what I want to say really quickly is that I will be following up with everybody who joined us this evening via email with a link to the Wildfire Pledge that we have online. And that's where, if you take the pledge, you will be entered to win, entered into a raffle to win a gift certificate to either our plant sale, our native plant sale, or hardware sales. And there will be more details on that in the email, but I didn't want to forget to mention that, yes, we did advertise that there will be a raffle and some prizes. So I will get that information to you after the fact, and it will also include our contact information and some other resources that I think might be really useful to share. So I just want to get that out and say thank you for joining us this evening. And then for the rest of you that feel like staying on, let's go ahead and do that. If anybody needs to leave, please feel comfortable doing that too.
Okay, just a couple more questions here. And to follow up on the fire pit question, which thank you so much, that was great detail. Who do we call about neighbors that are still using fireworks or sparklers? I also think that this could, if someone is burning during a burn ban, who do we call?
You give us a call. Call 911. Let them know that it's not an emergency, that you've got a neighbor that's burning some material illegally or during the burn ban. In fact, our crews just came back from a call that was a neighbor burning in their backyard within the burn ban currently, and we just pop on over nice and calm and ask you to put it out, and maybe leave you with a pamphlet with the burn regulations on it, and that's about it.
Excellent. So yeah, 911 non-emergency. Go ahead, Jenny.
I want to add, I just learned from the building services, oh, I might get his title wrong, Curtis Metz. There is now a notification you can sign up for burn bans. So I think in the same we've already linked to, you can scroll down to like, I think it's called Newsflash or something, and there's an option to get notified when there's a burn ban on. So that will happen automatically because not everybody sees that or knows that there's a burn ban on. And this is a conversation I've had with communities multiple times where there's been, somebody burning in a fire has escaped and they didn't realize there was a burn ban on. So I just wanted to put that plug in there as well. And I can send that direct link out to folks in my follow-up email also. That is all.
Great. And Jenny, actually, I think there's just one last question that we haven't answered, I hope, unless I missed one. But Lisa asked, do you have any recommendations for household fire safety and survival equipment that homeowners should have on hand? We were just talking about this. She says, I'm thinking of things like fire blankets. So yeah, Jenny, do you want to answer that? And you can pass it off too.
All right, I needed to unmute myself. Yeah, so and anybody can add to this. So this is something that I have just started to talk a little bit about. I'm not an expert on sort of the disaster go bag is what I would call it, which would probably be good not only for wildfires, but any kind of natural disaster to be prepared for. And you would think that I would have one of those, right? And I think about it all the time and I still don't have one. So I think the basics are making sure that you have at least 3 days of food and water for every person in your household, including your pets. You want to make sure you have your medications, a way to communicate, like a two-way radio. I'm just thinking off the top of my head here because I don't have a full list in front of me. Does anybody else want to add to that?
Having and or while we're asleep. So working fire alarms and then having a fire extinguisher that's and the readily available part is very much a big part of that. Owning a fire extinguisher that's buried in a box in the garage is not going to be helpful when the time comes. So having it somewhere that's readily available. And we know that kitchens are the #1 areas in our house where a fire has a propensity to start. So that would be a good place to think about having one handy.
I was going to say natural. Oh, go ahead, Jenny.
Well, no, go ahead, and then I'll add to that. I was going to change subjects slightly, so go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say I can't ever keep track of that stuff of what all the U-Haul load of stuff that you're supposed to have, but one resource that'll help you remember it I use is ready.gov. It's specifically on disaster preparedness kits and how to build them, what products to select. So it's a pretty easy site to remember, just ready.gov, and lots of ideas on that. And then fire safety stuff, following nfpa.org or the U.S. Fire Administration has a lot of tips and prevention stuff in there as well.
Yeah, and I was just going to add, there's some things to do, like if you know a wildfire is approaching, there's some things to pay attention to for sure, like shutting off your gas supply to your home or propane tanks, making sure you close all your doors and shut your windows, some things like that. And those tips are also available on ready.gov. They have a pretty extensive list of information that you can dig into for, you know, disaster preparedness type things.
I just wanted to throw out there, and I don't want this to come across the wrong way. This is not an anti-preparedness message by any stretch. But from the wildfire perspective, our goal as wildland firefighters and to educate you all is if you do this work around your homes, you have healthy forests around your homes, and we can keep these fires in control, you won't need any of this stuff. So don't let that get lost in the contents of the go bag.
Well, I guess one thing that I will point out really quickly that we have going for us in more urban and suburban areas is there's a lot of eyes out there. So as soon as there's smoke, a little bit of smoke, it's pretty likely that somebody's going to see it and they're going to call 911, and there's going to be a pretty quick response. So I think there's a little bit less maybe of an opportunity for things to grow super fast and become a massive disaster when you have more people around to catch things like that. That's just my perspective on that, to add to what Kirk was saying a little bit. So that should make you feel a little bit better. Okay, how are we doing? It looks like, Annika, did we get most of these questions here? Because we're about 11 minutes over now, and I want to let people move on with their evenings at this point.
Yeah, I think that we are good.
Okay.
If anybody has any last minute things, they can type it in, but I think that those are all the questions that I received.
Okay. And again, if you have questions that you weren't comfortable asking or you didn't get a chance to, we'll send contact information, and you can feel free to reach out to any of us and ask those questions directly. So thank you to all our speakers and our panel. Really appreciate you being here tonight and everybody who joined us.
Thank you for the invite, Jenny.
Yep, thank you.
You bet.